Daccord.
Bonsoir Yves Daccord. Bonsoir. Ah, je n'entends pas.
Dans 3 minutes 30.
Dans 3 minutes 30. Ok. Ça va bien se passer. Putain, ils m'ont mis une cheminée, Yves. Ils m'ont mis une cheminée derrière moi. Et tu me connais, moi, je suis comme un fromage à raclette. Dès qu'il fait chaud, tac, je perds du poids, quoi. Donc si tu me vois suer à grosses gouttes, j'ai
Il ne voit pas, il ne voit pas.
Bah, tous les gens vont se dire, machin, il a Covid-19 en direct, quoi.
Exactement. En fait, je vais faire toute une crise de Covid en direct sur 1 heure et à la fin, je décède. Ça fait le buzz.
Parce que sur des courses en direct, le truc est réglé.
Putain, ça me fait chaud là.
Allez, la pression, ils sont au moins 36 sur des niveaux des caméras.
On a les...
Ils sont 1000 sur YouTube, t'as partagé sur tes flux?
Ouais.
Trop bien, la classe. Le buzz.
Tu vois?
Pas serré. Ouais, toujours pas serré.
T'es piqué là, t'es bon au niveau du point?
Je suis bien. Ok. 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Et on n'aura pas tout à fait.
Et alors mon son, il vient d'où à part ça? Il vient de là ou il vient de là?
Ah, il vient de là. Très fort.
Donc tu m'as entendu pisser.
Ouais,
j'ai cherché le mieux. J'ai cherché le mieux.
J'ai entendu, t'as dit.
À ma défense,
Alors
j'ai cherché le
non,
mieux.
je serai là pour faire le compte à rebours et je ne trouvais pas mon vocal pour éviter du bruit son micro. Donc je te ferai un signe clair.
Ouais. Et tu veux qu'au début, je regarde Yves là ou je regarde la caméra?
Au début, je pense que c'est bien si tu t'adresses à la caméra. Tu vois, tu viens de faire ton message, etc. Alors la large. La large.
La large, ok, c'est là.
La large.
Ok.
Et en fait, je te dis une bêtise, je serai là si tu es d'accord, Laurent, même si c'est pas trop dans ton axe.
Ouais.
Comme ça, j'ai le retour.
1 minute 30.
1 minute 30.
Jonas, si ça bloque un peu, qu'il faut accélérer, que ça devient chiant, tu me fais un signe.
Ouais, si tout le monde s'embête, je te fais signe.
Ouais.
Imaginons un bug où Yves disparaît de l'écran, mais nous on l'a toujours. Je te fais également un signe que ça
Bon, moi,
continue.
ouais, ok.
Tant que je te dis pas d'arrêter, tu continues comme si de rien n'était.
Ok.
En mode tout
Une minute.
S'il faut lire sur les lèvres, Yves Daccord.
Ça, on aura un traducteur. On aura un traducteur en langage des signes. Bon, je redis pas bonsoir du coup, hein.
Non. Alors peut-être que ce que tu peux faire, c'est que
dis bonsoir à Yves.
rapidement tu dis bonsoir à Yves Daccord. Ouais. Il est là.
Trop loin, t'as l'impression de discuter ça. C'est bon. 30 secondes.
Il y a la souris qui est sur l'écran là.
Ouais. Bien vu.
Yves, 30 secondes.
30 secondes. Et ensuite,
J'ai
on
cru
va
que c'était un
tous se taire
tatouage.
à partir de maintenant.
Tout le monde se tait,
Tous
je
les
fais un signe.
portables en mode silence.
Tous les portables en mode silence.
Alors, tout le monde se tait.
Bonjour, il est 18h30, c'est l'heure du premier Corner Card Fireside Chat at Home, un dispositif extrêmement moderne que vous allez voir, on va tester aujourd'hui, ça sera en live sur Internet. Je vérifie que l'équipe a bien 2 mètres de distance, c'est tout bon. Et dans quelques secondes, je serai avec Yves Daccord qui va apparaître sur l'écran. Avec lui, on va discuter de comment s'adapter, comment est-ce qu'on doit réagir face à cette crise, comment est-ce qu'on doit réorganiser nos vies, comment est-ce qu'on doit réorganiser nos organisations, et puis dans quel monde allons-nous vivre demain. C'est dans quelques secondes, on va se connecter. À tout de suite avec Yves Daccord. Bienvenue à tous, merci d'être là avec nous. Merci Yves Daccord d'accepter notre invitation et d'être avec nous en direct de chez vous à Genève. Bonsoir à vous.
Bonsoir, heureux d'être là.
Alors Yves, vous avez vécu au Soudan, vous avez vécu au Yémen, vous avez vécu dans le Caucase et finalement l'endroit où vous aurez été le plus confiné, c'est Genève en Suisse. C'est là que vous aurez vécu le confinement le plus long. Une première question, comment est-ce qu'on vit un confinement? J'imagine que sur le terrain, au CICR, vous aviez beaucoup de gens qui ne pouvaient pas sortir de chez eux. Quels étaient les conseils que vous leur donniez pour tenir?
Ben d'abord, pour être très honnête, ça nous a pris quand même quelques jours pour comprendre qu'en fait, le confinement était vraiment réel Nous, on avait tendance à penser d'abord, on était très surpris de voir ce qui se passe et ça nous a mis du temps, vraiment pas mal de temps à comprendre les enjeux. Et en fait, les premiers enjeux, c'était les enjeux de logistique. En fait, ce qui s'est passé, la première chose qui nous a frappé, c'est que les avions ont disparu. Et pour le CICR, c'est fondamental parce qu'évidemment, vous dépensez logistique et vous devez penser aussi votre évacuation médicale. Et quand il y a des enjeux de santé, la première chose que vous pensez, c'est évidemment vos équipes, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Et vous vous rendez compte que tout à coup, votre système de santé pour aller protéger les gens, pour leur garantir que vous pouvez les sortir si c'est nécessaire, tout à coup, il s'écroule quasiment du jour au lendemain. Et là, c'était vraiment le premier grand choc qui nous a obligés à réfléchir à ça. Puis après, évidemment, on a compris qu'il y avait des enjeux qui touchaient les gens, chacun d'entre nous. Puis en fait, c'est très particulier parce que le confinement, il met en pression, en fait, chacun d'entre nous. Et on s'est rendu compte qu'on avait des collègues qui se trouvaient aussi en situation de confiné où ils n'avaient pas choisi d'être confinés. Et ça, c'est l'autre enjeu. Ici, moi, je vis à Genève dans un endroit qui est relativement agréable, mais j'ai quand même beaucoup de collègues qui ont été trouvés dans une situation compliquée où ils ont mis du temps à aller jusque chez eux ou dans des studios ou dans des endroits où on travaille facilement. Mais par contre, on n'a pas envie de passer automatiquement 2 ou 3 mois coincés avec des collègues avec lesquels on est content de travailler, mais on n'est peut-être pas content de passer 3 mois ensemble.
Mais j'imagine, de par la nature de votre activité, vous déployez des gens dans des pays qui sont extrêmement compliqués politiquement et en termes de sécurité. Donc, vous avez justement, de par la nature de votre métier et depuis très longtemps, des gens qui sont confinés dans une zone sécurisée. Hein, on entendait dans les nouvelles, il y a quelques années, parler de la zone verte à Bagdad, par exemple, ce genre de choses. Comment est-ce que vous abordiez, quel était le conseil ou quelle était la formation que vous donniez à ces gens qui allaient se retrouver bloqués chez eux pour que ça soit plus facile, pour peut-être qu'ils puissent tenir psychologiquement. Je vous demande, parce qu'aujourd'hui, on se retrouve tous confinés, et je voulais savoir s'il y avait des petits conseils que vous pourriez donner aux gens qui ne peuvent pas sortir de chez eux.
Il y a un certain nombre de conseils qu'on donnait, évidemment. Le premier, il est de 2 ordres. Le premier, c'est vraiment sois très attentif à l'autre. Au CICR, on travaille toujours avec d'autres gens. Sois très attentif à l'autre, quel qu'il soit. Ça peut être le membre de ton équipe, ça peut être le collègue qui dort dans la même maison que toi, mais juste fais attention, fais un petit check le matin pour voir comment ça va. Sois attentif parce que souvent, quand on est confiné, il y a des moments de décompression qui sont assez fortes. Et puis, il y a quelqu'un qui peut être en super forme et qui, tout à coup, peut vraiment être stressé, quoi. Donc, être capable de pouvoir être très attentif par rapport à l'autre. Puis, on travaille toujours beaucoup avec les responsables d'équipe parce que ce qui est très différent avec un confinement, c'est souvent, il y a 2 temps très différents. Il y a un premier temps qui est l'urgence. Un confinement, il est rarement planifié. Un confinement, il arrive. Il y a un moment donné, il faut regrouper, se préparer au confinement. Et puis, il y a une espèce d'adrénaline, d'excitation par rapport au confinement quand il arrive. Et souvent, dans ce premier temps, en fait, les gens sont assez alignés. Il y a un peu d'inquiétude, parfois un peu de peur. Mais en fait, le groupe fonctionne assez bien parce qu'on est dans une logique, j'allais dire, d'incendie, d'urgence. Le moment qui devient très compliqué, c'est quand le confinement commence à durer et surtout quand on ne sait pas combien de temps il va durer. Et c'est ce que je pense qu'on vit d'ailleurs, nous tous ici, en fait. On vit ce qui est le plus difficile dans un confinement. Vous êtes beaucoup plus prêt à tenir si vous savez que ça a une date et un temps de durée assez limité. C'est beaucoup plus compliqué quand, en fait, les enjeux sont beaucoup moins clairs. Vous ne savez pas quand vous allez sortir, vous ne savez pas qui va décider de sortir. Et ça, c'est les enjeux qui sont les plus compliqués. Et là, on joue beaucoup alors sur un travail de notre… Là, le leadership doit jouer un rôle important. Le responsable ou la responsable d'équipe, elle a une responsabilité très importante d'amener les gens ensemble, de vérifier à ce qui se passe, de faire un gros travail collectif pour qu'ensemble, on soit d'accord sur, au fond, une appréciation commune des enjeux, des règles qui peuvent alors évoluer en fonction de la durée.
Yves, je crois que en fait, on a pas mal de gens qui nous regardent qui souhaiteraient qu'on passe en anglais. Alors, c'est vrai qu'on voulait faire un événement national. Alors, on va faire ça, si ça vous va. Vous et moi, on va passer en anglais. So, Yves, what you just said is that you need to prepare people for uncertainty. There's this point where you realize that we don't know where we're going, and we're going to talk about that because there's a lot to say. And I would like to know what you think in terms of where the world is going. But what are the things that you can do to help people prepare for uncertainty?
I think the first thing, especially when it comes to humanitarian affair, you have to make sure that people understand that uncertainty is always challenging. You can't really be prepared for uncertainty. You can be prepared for disaster, for crisis, absolutely. And normally, you have some very specific rules of engagement. You have some some way that are very clearly and some regulations. And I think you know how to do it. And normally what you try to do is to make sure that this grammar, this crisis grammar, if you want, the grammar that you apply in crisis, is shared. This is really what you see when firefighter, for example, comes. They know there is a fire. They know exactly what to do. They will push people aside and they will go and operate. And then when it's finished, it's over. The complexity here with the confinement or when you have any confinement is when you don't know, when uncertainty goes on. And this is then very different. Then you have to trust the people. You have to regroup. You have to pause. You have to know also that you need to manage your energy in a very different way. And maybe this is maybe the crucial part. You need to manage your energy over time in order to be ready and to be able to pick up the signal when the signals are coming that things are changing, and then you can be then ready to move.
But a very radical change, Yves, that is happening right now on a personal standpoint, but even more on a professional standpoint, is that before, like an employee goes to their office and you can see what they do and you can coordinate with them. And suddenly people are left to themselves in their own homes and you cannot really have a top-down hierarchy like we used to do. So how do you deal with an organization where every node becomes autonomous in a way?
You know, I think it's something that is rather clear. There is no organization that I know that works only on one leadership or management style. This is not true. You can, if I look at my own organization, ICRC, where I've spent 27 years at the organization at different level, there is a command and control, classical leadership, and that's it. But that's only one part of it. And what you need to do as an organization is to agree that there are moments where your strategy of leadership and management is shifting, that you are working in a much more horizontal way, for example. And that is exactly what you're saying. That's the moment where you need to trust, in fact, the people. And possibly then find other way, which are not the classical way where, accountability is very clearly defined, but then you try to find a way where people have the responsibility, are able to work and to take responsibility. It works very well, to be honest, in my organization when people are directly connected and somewhat engaging with people affected by war or by the people controlling the people. So when you are in Afghanistan and you have to deal with the Taliban and negotiate with the Taliban or the Afghan government to have access to people, to migrants, for example, refugee, you know how to do it and somewhat you're empowered to do it. Where I agree with you, where it's more difficult these days is, of course, if you're behind your computer and you find the engagement with the people and the context is possibly more difficult. That's true. That can be more challenging.
You passed the direction of the ICRC to one of your colleagues, to your successor on 1st of March. It was announced a few months ago. You were supposed to just have a normal handover, and then actually the transition happened in the middle of this absolutely unpredictable crisis. Can you tell us a little bit the story of this moment in the life of the ICRC? Because you are a very trained organization to unpredictable events. You are used to respond to crisis. So I think for people listening, it would be very interesting to hear how yourself and your organization adapted to that. So when did that first moment happen, when you realized there would be no airplanes and you could not take your delegates out of the various countries? Like, when did you realize something special is happening?
So maybe a word, Laurent, about my organization. So it's the International Committee of the Red Cross. We are 20,000 professionals, 1,000 in Geneva, and the 19,000 other are spread in 100 countries around the world. And where my colleagues are is very rarely in capitals. Most of the time they are in difficult areas. So if you look at Syria, for example, you will find some of my colleagues in Damascus, but you will also find them in Homs, for example, in Aleppo. And it's true in all the country. So it's true. And now if I come back to me, I've now spent 10 years as the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It was absolutely foreseen that I will leave my position end of March. And I would say I was preparing for that, including myself emotionally, because it's an important position. Keep me both in terms of energy, but also in terms of emotion and I would say intelligence. Very, very, very alert and ask me a lot over all these years. And I was really ready to leave. My successor, Robert Mardini, had been chosen in November. So I knew that was his moment, and I was emotionally, it's interesting also to reflect about myself, I was emotionally starting to disconnect slightly from the organization. And then suddenly COVID-19 happened. And it took me as a leader, a few days to reconnect with, wow, I mean, this is not just a normal classical crisis, because we have very clear modus operandi with task force, and we had a task force dealing with COVID-19. We saw that happening. We were more looking at, I would say at the time, more the supply chain questions, more the logistic problems, and some of the very clear health and duty of care issues. But it was somewhat clearly defined. And me as a director general, I'm dealing with a lot of crises. So I saw that as one crisis. And as a person, I must say this time, it took me a bit more time to realize, no, this is not just one crisis, this is the crisis. And that request and that ask that me as a director general, I'm leading this crisis. I need to do that. And I decided that, I think it was the third week of February, where I realized, this is a crisis. But I must be honest with you, is I never thought end of April, this is a crisis which will last so long. I thought, that's a crisis which will really affect us as an organization. It will be very difficult, but I never thought it would be that big. But anyway, I did that end of April. I talked to my successor, Robert, and Robert at the time was based in the US. So we made one good decision, was to bring him already a bit earlier. And by mid-March, that was a moment where we had a big discussions together, is, do I stay? I'm the, I know the organization very well. I've worked with the organization now for 10 years as a CEO. So I could stay for a few more months, or do I go? And that was an interesting moment for me also, and for Robert to discuss. And I think that's the moment, mid-March, when we realized this crisis will reshape our organization. We understood that we started really to get it. So that was a moment where we decided, no, it's the moment where Robert needs to go. And I left then the organization by end of March, at the peak of the COVID, but with a very strong feeling that was the right moment for me to leave. But more importantly, the right moment for my successor to come in and to work with the team in order to be prepared for the next phase of COVID-19.
We saw that there is a lot of organizations that were not ready for people working remotely, and that had to struggle, and to speed up the adoption of work from home technologies. How ready was ICRC, and what are the measures that you had to implement because of suddenly everybody working from home?
I think we were ready with our systems. We were maybe not ready as we thought with, in fact, our people, and maybe with the logistics. So to make it long story short, we had system in place in terms of communication. We are using, in fact, some of the system that we also disregarded some other system for data questions. The point, though, of course, what we didn't expect is to have so many and so quickly half of the organization, which is we were 1,000 of us, roughly speaking, systematically on remote connections and all that. And we had to move suddenly to 8 and then 10,000 of us moving at so-called at home or out of the office, and in a very short period of time. And of course, as an organization, we can't afford to have the collapse of our system. So that was, for our IT colleague, that was a super, super complicated moment to be able to manage that moment. But we did that well somewhat. And I felt that was okay. Where it was much more challenging was the people. No surprise about that, because it's the first time for my own organization that you have this, how can I say, a collapse, if you want, between the worry, very personal, of every single individual at the ICRC, rightly so. What is this COVID-19 happening? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my family? What does that mean if I can't get out of the country? What does that mean for my colleagues? So I think a worry about a personal worry, a worry about my own ability to work with my team, and then a worry about what is happening to the people I'm trying to help on a daily basis. So we had this 3 level that was collapsing. And this is the first time it happens to us as an organization. So we put priority on the duty of care to make sure that our colleagues will feel and understand that we will do our utmost about their health. We understood very quickly that there was also not just a classical health issue, but also a mental health. So we were very careful about making sure that we would check in with the people every morning, that the remote management needs also, in fact, a very different way to relate to each other. And I think that was maybe my big discovery, was that we are not equal when it comes to remote management or to work from from home. Not only because our home is different, but maybe because the situation in our organization is very different. Sometimes the team are very close, they're very closely related. We had new people who just came to the ICRC and had to suddenly go to their apartment and work from home. A lot of people were also worried about what will happen over time. So I think all this anxiousness, angst, right, which comes in the organization is something that you need to welcome. You need to be clear. And I think the challenge is then to be clear as a leader of what you know and what is important for the organization to know and what you don't know. And that is maybe the most interesting time right now in terms of leadership and in terms of bringing people together. We're living in a time, Laurent, and I think all the people listening to us today knows, we still don't know a lot about the COVID-19. And that is quite amazing.
But what you say is that technology itself or tools do not solve the problems. Like you need to teach people how to use them. So there were two things. One was to deploy the tools, and second was people to adapt. I want to come back on something because you said, I understood that it's not a crisis, but it is the crisis. Why do you say it's the crisis more than every other crisis you've been working on for 27 years? And unfortunately, the world doesn't lack crises that need attention. What told you this is the crisis?
It's always difficult because if I look at my own organization and myself, we went through major crises. I'm just thinking about, for example, the genocide in Rwanda or the Balkan War, on Syria today, or the migration questions, for example, or anything related to weapons and the development of weapons. So I think we've lived through a major crisis. And if we all remember in December 2019, we were all reflecting, for example, about the speed and the pressure of environmental change and the catastrophe that we saw in Australia, but that was the same I saw in Somalia, in the entire Sahel. So, but none of them, if I realize, truly were the crisis. And the is not so much about the intensity, it's about the fact that the first time in my own life, I've seen all of us, without any exceptions, being affected by the very same, in fact, crisis. Maybe differently, we have different, it has different impact on us, on our family, we have different experience, but all of us without any exceptions. And that is what for me makes it the crisis. If I look at my own organization, that is of course a major crisis, because it means that suddenly the way you work, the way you interact, your relevance is maybe put at stake. Who knows what the Red Cross will be in a year time? Most likely a different organization that it was even in March. So that is quite striking. And this is just if I look at myself and my own organization, but then look around us and we all feel, oh, wow, our social fabric is shifting. We all understand that things are really moving, but we have very different understanding of what it means. So I think, yes, it is right, absolutely the crisis. And this crisis will define a lot of what we are and how do we stand for, but also our organization and the way we relate maybe to the world.
But Yves, I mean, you have been at the ICRC for 27 years. You've been knocking on the door of governments, raising emergencies all around the world where, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are in danger, and this crisis still continue. And, there is this difficulty to get funded, for example, for an organization like the ICRC. Why is it that suddenly this one crisis, governments are willing to spend what looks almost like an infinite amount of money to beat this one?
For two reasons. One is because it's happening first in the north. Let's be very clear. So it's the first big crisis that we have, global crisis, which is hitting, in fact, first and foremost the north and China. So if you look, the two big economic center of the world are, or let's say the three. You can say China, Europe, and then the US. Wow, almost in 2 months' time. That's unheard of. And it has a very strong public health dimensions, but also a very strong social and economic dimensions. And I think, so that's one. And so I think politicians, government, they understood rather quickly not all the measure that they needed to take, but once they saw the figures, they saw the model, they saw the potential impact. And when it started, they understood absolutely that that was it. There was no other choices than to go. And I think my sense is most of the government at the beginning, they went for a very crisis management, very, very narrow. We try to react, and a public health crisis management. And then they discover, day by day or week by week, that this crisis will have first a major economic, but also social impact. So that's the reason why you see suddenly governments trying to find. And I think you will see over time there will be a lot of discussions, because governments, they were blind, which is also very rare. The governments still today are blind when it comes to COVID-19. If you look at some of the critical questions, they have no answer today. So I think they took also decision, nationwide decision. It's the first time that government take so heavy decision for all the nation, locking down an entire nation, and then investing as much as you can to make sure that the nation do not collapse completely in terms of economy is something important. And my sense, Laurent, is that we have seen just the beginning. Because of course, if you think about that, we understand already that the economic and the social will have impact, and government will continue, and we be willing to continue to just control and try to maintain somewhat a minimum of coherence in this very complex environment. Maybe the second reason, Laurent, is I also feel that governments and politicians understood if they were not able to respond, they will be totally gone, even next day. So they understood, and you can be the Chinese president, you can be the Italian prime minister, or the Minister of Health of Switzerland. You understand very well that there are some change that need to happen, and you need to be able to react very quickly. Otherwise, you're not relevant anymore.
But the numbers are quite striking. I think from memory, there's 8 million people dying from pollution. There is 1.3 million people dying from car accidents every year. And yet we don't see such a drastic reaction. And I mean, definitely this crisis was very random. But for example, the environmental crisis is in a way predictable. We see the early signs of that. And yet we've been trying, all of us, to mobilize and to get traction on solving these issues, and not much is happening. And then suddenly, something that looks like a lesser threat gets an infinite response. So how do you see that? And maybe is there a learning for us that how could we turn this climate change emergency into something that suddenly society reacts as violently and as quickly as it just happened with COVID?
It's a very good point. And I think you will see a lot of learning and a lot of discussions over the next coming months about why we did that and why so strong and not or whatever. So far, what I perceive is maybe 2 or 3 emerging reflections. The first one is COVID-19, and that's very different from the climate, allow you as a president or as a minister to take action, concrete action, and you are rewarded for that. On climate, I can decide if I'm the president of the United States, I can decide that I'm moving out of the Paris Agreement, or I can decide to change something. The reality is, it will not really impact you and your country immediately. This is long-term, in fact, impact. And the problem is most of our global crises are global and they are long-term. So they request, in fact, major collaboration between countries, and they also request a long-term investment. And these 2 elements are gone. I mean, countries do not produce any more consensus between themselves, and politicians, governments, but not only, I would say, corporate, all of us are living in a very short term where we want decisions to have an impact on short term. So COVID-19, surprisingly, of course, is calling for collaboration. But even if you don't want to collaborate, you can still take action. And you are perceived and you're rewarded as a politician who takes actions, and it is perceived like. Look at all the survey around the world. Even if people are challenging some of the government, they still feel that the way government have acted when they acted was positive, and they liked, in fact, the sense of the disaster management part of the government. And government, that's a moment where they can play, where they can still do something. Where you will see a much more divided response and much more complicated is now the phase in which we are now moving in, which will be a phase where the situation will be very complicated, where people will have a very different view about what needs to happen. And we are moving now out of a classical disaster management, if you want, where the command and control works well, to something which will request much more consultation, collaboration, discussions, maybe also recognition that we've made some mistake, and that will be a much more challenging. So my answer to you is, at no moment there was a reflections of what is the most important. I think the question was, COVID-19 came, it was anecdotal in a sense that it was possible to follow that almost on a daily basis. Media liked it, let's be very clear also. So people realized that. And I think it also, maybe that's more a philosophy question. I think we are not ready in our society, including, by the way, in China, it's interesting to observe, to accept without doing anything that hundreds of thousands of people will be killed. That will not be possible for any government to accept that. So I think it's also a reaction of survival on the government side. Look at the few governments who decided to let go. I'm not talking about Sweden, who didn't let go, but was quite smart in the way they did it. Government was said, no, let's not react too strongly. They are in an extremely difficult political situation.
Yeah. So there's maybe a lesson to draw about the governance of the world, and maybe give more incentive for politicians to act long term and to collaborate.
That's the Laurent. Let's stop for a minute. That is the lessons. The problem is we're living in a world which is not just a governance. We're living in a world where all the rest works on very short term. The media work on short term. We all are working on short term, and we're living on short term. The financial market lives in very short term. So how do you want to have a governance which is able to say we're investing in 20 years for, in fact, education, social dynamic, and climate? Very, very difficult.
So Yves, we know each other, and I like to have dinner with you because you're an insider of the world politics. You know world leaders, you spend time discussing with them. It's always very interesting to hear about your views. So I'd like to tell you a few topics and get your opinion on them. First, tell me, are we going, according to you, towards more or less democracy on a global level?
On a global level, we're going to a more polarized environment, sadly. So I think we will see appearing over the next coming months and years, in fact, a more polarized environment in almost each society. We will see also clearly, I would say, over the next 2 or 3 years, somewhat, I don't know if we call it, but let's say more exceptional rule, absolutely clear. So more, in fact, less democracy, if you want to call it less democracy. I'm always careful about democracy because you can be in a democracy and have state of emergency, as we saw that in France, right? Remember a few years ago. But we will see more exceptional rules and more tensions about, in fact, the way we would like this next phase to happen, no questions. And I think we also underestimate a pandemia. Normally, if you look at all the movies, all the reflections, all science fiction, always interesting to look at that. They always have 3 scenarios. One scenario is a pandemia happens and our society somewhat is able to muddle through. And at the end of the scenario, the society is more fragile, but somewhat the same society. Scenario 2 is you have more social unrest, you have more people dying, it's more complicated, the political authorities are challenged, and this scenario 2 leads to, in fact, state of emergency, authoritarian regime, or authoritarian response at least. And the scenario 3 is a complete collapse of our society, right? And I don't think we are in scenario 3, but I don't think neither that we are just on a scenario 1. I think we should recognize that most likely we will see scenario 1 and scenario 2. We will see piece of scenario 2 in some places that could be very surprising, where the level of unrest, the level of social tensions will be so big that, in fact, government will impose state of emergency. And we will see that coming rather soon.
There's going to be more technology in society. You know, the tech stocks are booming. The internet giants are adding users. Do you think it's going to be a positive or a negative?
A mixed. The positive will be about the fact that I really believe over the next coming 2 or 3 years, people will be more aware, individual like you and me, will be more aware about the importance of data, because it will be the first time that they will realize that the data that, we are all somewhat giving up to anybody will have an impact on their life, and they will feel it. It will not just be any more advertisement that you receive when you Google, but it will be a message telling you, somebody close to you have been declared positive. So please contain yourself. And then you will say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. And then you realize, oh, I can't access anymore to my banking account or I can't take a train because now suddenly there is a machine or there is an algorithm who, based on the information I'm giving and based on the algorithm, has decided that I should not move anymore. So I believe that what is happening, what will happen to us, will create more awareness as individual of, how do I control my data? What does that mean for me as a person? What does it mean for my family? I think that at least the debate around data will be much more wild, maybe, and widely shared. That's it. Yeah. On the negative is I am very nervous about the governance of all that. I think I still our tech giant just moving out and just seeing them more giant with all what it means. And what I see arriving is, and that's maybe a worry I have, is I see also not only the tech giants, being more bigger, but I also see the tensions between China and the US, for example, really, really playing out massively when it comes to internet and when it comes to technology. And that worries me a lot.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. But to finish on technology, I think one of the smartest way of thinking about it, somebody always said, like, the problem with data is the change of context, is that you give your data in a certain context and then something changes. And we just had a very interesting case in Switzerland where the national telecom operator suddenly handed out the data of the past month. And when you gave the data, you didn't know that in the end it would end up being, and it's a big question. What do you think is going to be the impact of COVID on the American situation and especially on the election?
It's a very difficult one to know. I think the first one, what is interesting to observe is how much COVID-19, in fact, put a very, very clear light, if you want, on the weakness of the American system, right? On the fact that you have a society, and this is not related only to the Trump area, it's already coming from quite a long time, a society which somewhat has decided that 15 to 20% of the population can live off the grid, not part of my society, part of no system. And you see today the extreme weakness of the society and the enormous inequality. And I think the lack of trust, that is a super, super worrying when you see the US. By the way, I'm also worried because if I look at China, I don't have a feeling that the people have a lot of trust about their government neither. So if you look at these two powers where there is a lack of trust, that also reflects something where I find Europe not perfect at all. But if you take trust as maybe the indicators, I would say the way, again, it's not perfect, but the way, for example, a country like Switzerland or Germany, a federal country, or Sweden, are dealing with the crisis, I have a sense that it is increasing the trust between, the people, the local authority, the regional authority, the national authority. It's not perfect, but there is something about the trust which is an important one. Now, back to your questions about the US, I am of the opinion that the trust is already very low, and not just towards the president, among the people, between the community. That will just create more tensions. And I would not be surprised at all, and I hope I'm wrong, that the elections, in fact, will not happen as planned in 2020. I would not be surprised at all that the presidential elections will be postponed or will be canceled for a while based on a state of emergency. So that's typically a country where I'd not be surprised at all that state emergency will be called. I hope I'm wrong, really. It is. But Laurent, can I just, on that one, interrupt you? I'm also saying it's not just the fact that the president might want to decide that. It's also maybe because the situation in the US might be so difficult that objectively, it will not be possible to hold elections. So you may so much violence or so much problematic that you won't be able to do that.
Well, we saw that Macron kept the local elections during the lockdown, and it was a very big problem. But just considering that thought is absolutely insane. Can you speak a little bit about China? It felt like China was on its way to world dominance, and everything was looking quite good for them. And there was this like a road and belt initiative, and the GDP was growing. And suddenly, it seems that their position in the world order might not be so easy to define. They were like shooting for the number one seat. Where do you see that region going, that country going?
First of all, I think we should agree that China is not looking at number one or the world the way we look at that. And we means the Western world. We have a tendency to want to be the number one. We have the tendency to want to drive the world as we want. That we did that for the last 2 centuries. I think China is looking at that differently. I think the first element of China, I think we should always remember, is that they have a very large population, and still 1/3 of the population is in poverty, objectively. So I think for them, how do I bring my population out of poverty is still a big issue. And one of the big issue for China is also to try to close the gap, or at least maintain it, between the people who are starting to become rich, the middle class, and in fact the rest of the population. So I think there is already one issue. The second issue is a super important issue, which is a social issue. There's it's a population like us, which have aged very quickly, but they are moving into our same issues when it comes to aging and our old society, without having the same level of money and the same level of system. So I think China knows that 2 major issues, and the third one is of course ecology. They have a major issues in terms of ecology. Being the factory of the world has been rather dramatic for them. Where I agree with you is I think it's not so much about China being the number one in the world. I think it's more about the internal dynamic in China. And I'm really not an expert, but there's maybe one thing that I want us to reflect about. I always felt that China and the power of China, the Communist Party, reflected well about sharing the power. And that was, I think, done by Deng Xiaoping after Mao. He decided that even if you are the number one of the party and the country, there was some limit of your power. And you could do 5 years and extend it 5 more years. And afterwards, you had to leave, which is quite amazing if you think about that. And I think it was an interesting way to share power. I mean, the Communist Party is so big that it was an interesting one to share that between the different factions. And somewhat it brought all the people within China, the people who had power, to somewhat contribute to the same objective, because you knew after a few years, it might be your turn to lead. So you have an interest that the ship goes in the right direction. What I'm very concerned, and I think few people talk about that, what I'm very concerned is that the actual president of China, Xi Jinping, decided to, in fact, abandon this limit of time in power. And that was decided and accepted by the parliament in China, I think 2 years ago, which means today Xi Jinping is in power without any more limit of time. And this is something which is interesting, because it means that suddenly, if you are in power, if you're part of the power in China or the ecosystem, I mean, and you have a different perspective, or you feel yourself maybe threatened by the center of the power, your interests are very different. Your interest is then you want them to fail, because it's the only way to change power. So I think what we underestimate is also the complexity of power dynamic within China, what it means. We see this a little bit, and I think we are underestimated how complex it is. Last but not least about China, they are in a model, they choose our model, and they are a model where they have no choice to go for a 6 to 7% increase of GDP by year. This is an enormous challenge for them. I don't think they will manage this year. And if they don't manage, then they have the huge social issues. Again, poverty, but also retirement, for example, which will be super challenging. So I have a sense that you have a China which is maybe willing to be number one. I don't think that's the point. I think China understands that they need, in fact, surprisingly enough, a model where you have a model where you don't have a lot of protectionism. If protectionism is too high for China, they really bet on liberalism. Surprisingly, it's a communist party, but they bet on liberalism and free trade. If the world is moving now to protectionists, China will be one of the first ones to suffer.
Yeah. Speaking of presidents who stay in power for a very long time, there is a third big pole of power that we haven't yet mentioned, and that you know also, and that's very, very active in certain regions of the world. Can you tell us a little bit what's the situation in Russia right now?
as much as we know, right? Let's be so honest. I think Russia is also a super interesting country to understand, with at least 3 or 4 elements around that. The first one is, I think we also underestimate, like with China, we underestimate not so much the population. They don't have a large population, but the territory. I mean, Russia is so enormous. I always say, it's a territory of 11 hours, fuseau horaire, 11 different. I mean, if you think about that, this is just amazing. And being able to manage that at a time. B is, we underestimate also how much the leadership of Russia, both right now executive, but also I would say the intelligentsia in Russia, they still have been influenced dramatically by the collapse of Soviet Union. I think they liked it or not, it was a huge shock for the entire society. They were not prepared for that. They saw that happen. I still believe that they think it could happen again. We always underestimate that. So what you see is also a Russia regime, which is, despite of what we think, somewhat in a survival mode. And again, not trusting a lot, the people among themselves, but also not trusting their partner. And last but not least, you have a Russia which is very tactical, quite remarkable, if I would say, to play their game. Sorry to say that. If you think about the GDP is, I think, not bigger than Spain. It's amazing to think about that. And they still have been able to reestablish themselves as an important and major players in key area like Middle East, for example. But it's very tactical. It's very related to their power, cyber power or military power, where the big questions for Russia, of course, is the questions of resources, economy, social. We will see also how they get through COVID-19. Looks difficult. And again, the price of the petrol, for example, they've really bet on oil a lot. That will also affect long-term China. So I think the message is, if you look at the P5, the 5 permanent member of the UN Security Council, and you think about what happens over the last 2 years, France, UK, Brexit, the US, where they're going through right now, China and Russia, you say, oh, wow, the big power are each of them in a situation that they never, ever thought, and we never thought would be 3 years ago. And each of them are somewhat in a survival mode, which in that case, normally, you ask me about what will happen in the years to come, that is normally not really a good signal, because it should be a signal of collaboration. In that case, I think it will be a signal of more competition.
But because the question, we have people watching us, and they have to make decisions about their own lives and their organizations and their businesses about what to do. So I'm trying to get a sense from you for what you think is going to be the new world order. I was born in the 70s, in the West. So definitely we called it the American Cup. It was an American rule in a way. And I'm trying to get a sense of, what are going to be the different poles and
okay,
what balance are we going to find in tomorrow's world?
Any response? But what I can try to say is it seems to me there is 2 trends, and they are not compatible, but they might be compatible in few years. The first one is you will have more polarization. That's very clear. You will have more tension. So you won't have, which is already the case, one pole. You will have different pole, right? That's already the case very clearly. And different rules of the game, which makes it very difficult then to agree. So I think you will see more competitions for a while, more tensions. But what is interesting is none of the new pole or the pole are strong enough. They will all be challenged within their pole, which is also interesting. So it's not just polarization between the big pole, but also within the pole you have polarization. My sense, though, I'm an optimist. I'm a pragmatic optimist. So my sense is, over time, though, I think this polarization and tensions will lead us over the next 5 to 10 years to then a different set of issues. And I think we will see emerging new governance. I'm deeply convinced about that. Around issues, maybe around a new type of structure. I'm of the opinion that cities, for example, will have a more responsibility. State will continue maybe to fight, but cities today are much more open and much more willing to collaborate among themselves. And tomorrow, there will be 70% of the people living in cities. I think they will play a bigger role, and they will have to come, because we will have to govern. If I just not think the internet is a good example, but think about, for example, everything related to the coronavirus and all the questions related to, in fact, our health, the virus, let's say. Think about the gene, about the biology. I mean, all these questions will require a kind of global governance, and I don't think states will be in a position to offer that. So
We're
if they're
going
not
to-
able to offer that, we will see, let's say, emergence of different global, maybe regional governance, and we have to be ready. This governance will not look as they are right now. Maybe a mix between state and cities, and maybe universities. I don't know. It will be super interesting to observe, but it will come. I have no doubt about it.
We're gonna talk about that, because your next step is actually going to be to cross the Atlantic and go to Harvard to study and to research political systems. And in a way, what you say is that the problem we have is that we're going to a world where there's going to be different poles of power. And yet you also said that countries have a very hard time collaborating right now. So these are two things that we're going to have to put together. Can you just say a word about Switzerland? Where do you see, we talked about these gigantic countries and continents and mega superpowers. What do you see for Switzerland in the coming years?
I have the impression, I must say, first, recognition. I found that the government, the central government, but also most of our local government, the canton and the cities, did really a good job in COVID-19 so far. And I found that the mixed model of a certain assertiveness, and here really kudos to specifically, not only, but specifically to Alain Berset. I was really impressed by him, and he was really Champions League, right? Really, I've seen a lot of
because he's from Fribourg and he has the same haircut than you. That's why you say that.
He has the same haircut than me. He has a kind of same hat also. But I found him, but he has more responsibility, and I found him quite remarkable in his ability to generate trust. He was firm when need be. He was open when he didn't know. And what I found interesting, he was able to show that he was collective. And what Switzerland has shown, which I found really interesting, is the power of collective. Even if you don't have all the ministers, at the very same level, and some of them are maybe less good than the other, somewhat they've been able to, bring their difference together. And it shows, very interestingly for me, that a model when you have a one-man show, this is a model which works well in time of crisis, maybe for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, but not over time. Look at France. I know France has a different relationship to power and to king and queen. But in the case of France, I would say not being able to play more collectively is a big issue. And I think they really have to learn. It's not just about the minister, the prime minister, or the president, but it's also being able to play with the region, play with the different people. It starts now, but it's difficult. Switzerland has aligned, I would say, rather well the famous 3 level: national level, canton level, let's say regional and canton level, and then the level of the community around the cities or the little village. And the way they've done that, I'm quite amazed by that. By the way, interesting to observe, a model which is not that far in a way, which is the US. They have also this 3 level, presidential level, they have the state level, and they have the city level. It's interesting to observe in a model where the 3 level then don't agree, when they fight, and that is then the end of the world. And here in Switzerland, the fact that we are able to do that and the way we've done that is quite amazing. I'm also amazed by the population, really. Not perfect, but again, kind of a steady, rather robust way to go across that. We are rich, let's be very clear. We have also fantastic health system. So I think we are also well placed. But the way we've done that, my sense is it will for a while at least reinforce relationship. It will reinforce trust in the government. And that's important because the next phase is a super complex phase. And it will be important to have that because Switzerland will have, though, to rediscuss, and that will, so I think the next 2 years will be okay, I think very clearly, for all reason I mentioned. Afterwards, I think you will have more challenge because you will have people within Switzerland and part of society which would then expect really serious change in the way we are looking at ecological and social issues. You saw the vote already, the people we elected in Bern. I think some part of a society will have to accept this is the new way. So expectation will be that the government in Switzerland will continue, if you want, to manage smartly solidarity. That's what they've done without realizing maybe. And the expectation is that it's not finishing only, end of or beginning of June when the confinement is over, but that is last over time. And that might require quite a change then in terms of the political landscape in Switzerland.
It's the problem. What's great about a country like France is that when things go wrong, you can actually blame the king. So, there is a finger you can point to someone.
And you can then kill him.
Exactly. A quick word on Sweden. What you said, they manage it in a very smart way. I think from the outside, people think that basically the government did nothing and just let people go on with their lives. No. Can you tell us a bit what happened in a few minutes?
So what Sweden did, they made a choice, right? And the choice was not that far away from Switzerland. The only difference is that they decided that they wanted from day one to have a bit more of the population being somewhat exposed to the COVID. It was a bit of a bet, but they didn't do the bet of UK at the time. We decided, let's open everything, and then suddenly had to go back because it was organized. It was well thought through. You had debate, you still have debate in Sweden, if it was the right way to do that. And the government make a decision. So I think there was at no moment people in Sweden who thought it was not well decided. Now they can agree or not if it was the good strategy. I am of the opinion, the jury is still out, that they did a smart way, and because what they did, they didn't go for what we had in the rest of Europe, which is a massive lockdown, because we didn't know. So we close everything at the risk of having a huge social impact, right? I think what Sweden did better, it seems to me, is they fine-tune, if you want, the measure, and they were ready to take some risk, including to have higher numbers of people dying, but not higher, scandalous higher, a higher in a way that you can still talk about it and socially fine. So my sense is they've done a good job so far compared to, because they are not, you can't compare with South Korea or Taiwan, that are sometimes people say that's the model. They did very differently from day one. They have a very different experience. They went through already coronavirus, in the 2000 with SARS. They have a very different, they also much tougher about testing and data management, and people wear masks. That's a very different. Sweden is interesting to observe because it's a model and a society which is very similar to ours. And it's interesting to observe that. And I would say again, Laurent, the things to observe is trust. I also found super interesting to see how a country like Sweden, and in general the Nordic country, but also Switzerland and Germany, where somewhat there is still a trust, not a perfect trust, but a trust and a social fabric between us and the people who govern us, still works, then in fact it's more easy for a country to go through this kind of crisis. And so there's an acceptation about this is my role as government, but this is also your role as people. Whereas in France, for example, or Italy or Spain, the relationship and the tensions between people and government seems to be much bigger. And then the government has somewhat to impose to people the regulation. Otherwise, the government think that people will not respect it. So that is a very different dynamic.
As you said, this crisis reveals a lot about the country and about maybe its weaknesses and its strengths, and it's something that we can only win together. It's very interesting also, you mentioned the UK, but that made this decision to not do anything. And then I think politically speaking, Boris Johnson was quite lucky to get the COVID, because it's going to be harder to blame him for not seeing it come. But that decision was not paid until the end.
My point was not that Boris, in fact, you can make some choices about the policy and you can maybe not be wrong. What was very disruptive, which was really problems with Johnson, is that he had disdain, he behaved, kind of, and that I found always painful. In Sweden, there was no politician say that COVID is nothing. No, they said COVID is very important, it's complicated, let's find a way to do that. Whereas, in fact, Johnson, for at least a month, he really said, this is bullshit, this is a small fever. He himself even showed that he went into political party programs and meetings, shake hands, and suddenly he realized, oh my God, it's happening to me and to my society. Maybe exactly what you said. I mean, where Boris Johnson would be saved is in a way that he has survived that. And I think on that one, I recognize he has been very generous and quite impressive in his ability then to recall what happened to him. And especially when he talks about the two nurses who took care of him. And in fact, one of them is a Portuguese nurse and the other one is New Zealand, which I found interesting when you are politicians, which is in fact calling for closing border and to throw out all the migrants. So interesting to observe that sometimes life is bringing you places that you don't want to be.
he copied Trump on the beginning of the play, then he took his own direction after, because they were both saying that it was a bullshit at the beginning, but now one has changed their mind, the other less. Yves, we have a few minutes remaining. I think a lot of people are wondering what are your next steps. So you said a few things about that. You are flying to Boston. You're joining a very prestigious university. When you are allowed to fly, can you tell us a little bit what's next for you?
Yeah, with pleasure. My passion has always been, in fact, to look at how people are connecting to each other, and also how do we govern that, and what does that mean. And since few years, I really saw that political systems, and not just people, and not just government, are really in a dire situations. So I'm not looking, for example, at President Trump only as a personal issue, and it is, but I was also looking at him as a symptom of a society, but also of a political system. So I think I'm interested to reflect about what are the political system and the new political system that we need to put in place. We need to go at systemic level. Even if you think about also ecology, for example, you have to think differently about that. I was not really sure how to go about it. I was trying a little bit and tested few ideas, and finally, the most interesting proposal I got was, in fact, to my surprise, I must say, it was in Harvard, in Boston, in the US, where I will lead an initiative on, in fact, specific human flux. So all the migration, but also the movement that we do between, one country to another, or between one city to another, how it is managed, controlled, and what type of surveillance state are using to control, contain, but also to segregate people, and to look at what would be then the role of cities or other structure if they want to challenge the government. So if tomorrow a government says, I don't want this kind of people in my cities or in my country, and a university or a city says, no, I want them to be in my cities, what will happen? How does that work? What are the new political systems? And what is interesting is I will try to bring a multidisciplinary approach around that, of course, around data, because that's super important, around security, but also around political science, urban design, super interesting to look at that, and art. I'm deeply convinced that artists will help us, I think, to develop a much smarter understanding of what are we talking when we talk about segregation, when we talk about surveillance, what does that mean for community? And that's great. So normally the plan is, as you mentioned, is to go to Boston and to start to work in Harvard. If it's possible, I might have to do Boston and Harvard from Geneva. We'll see how it works.
So Yves, to wrap up, thank you very much for the absolutely fascinating discussion. I mean, you gave us a lot of insights on a personal level. You told us we have to play collectively if we want to win over this crisis. We have to be resilient. We have to be agile. And you also pointed us to some of the big challenges. Are we going towards a world where we have different powers competing for supremacy? And you said, we have to maybe rethink the governance of the world to bring more long-term thinking, to bring more collaboration, and to make this kind of actions, long-term actions, collaborative actions, turn them into political reward. That as a politician we have incentives to do that. That's a lot of very big questions to ponder. But I want to conclude and ask you one last thing. You're like me. You have 3 daughters. What is your advice for them? They are all in their 20s. What is the one advice you give them now while this crisis happens on how to do good for themselves?
I don't have a lot of advice to give them, The only thing I can give them is love. And that's what I can do the best. And maybe to tell them, continue to do what you do, which is reach out to people. Tell the people that you love, tell them that you love them. It's really important. Don't underestimate that. I think it's a super important moment. The response is in the collective. You can do a lot as a person. You can always do more if you respect and bring the people with you, and continue to do what is happening. The world in front of you is a fantastic. What is amazing for my daughters and for young leaders and young people in that generation, by the way, maybe also for us, because we will live that through, is we are not in a time where we'll have to replicate what we did. They will not have to copy us. They will have to develop, in fact, solutions which are new. And I like that. I found that fantastic. If you're curious, if you're open, if you're interested, that's a fantastic moment. And let's be also honest. My three daughters, Ines, Emma, and Julie, they have the chance to be born in Europe, to live in Europe, to be closely related to Switzerland. I mean, this is difficult to do better.
For, I think, the past 3 or 4 years, I think the focus has been on voices dividing the world. And maybe that crisis is a chance to, as you just said, to reconnect and to rebuild the social fabric. We can all do something on our personal level. We can all do something in our communities, in our families. I think that's a very, very strong and very much needed ray of hope. Thank you very much, Yves Daccord.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We still have people watching online. Merci à tous ceux qui ont regardé ce live. Et eh bien, une très bonne soirée à vous. Et puis, on se retrouve pour le prochain Corner Card Fireside Chat at Home. Merci beaucoup.
Bonsoir.
Magnifique. La régie me fait signe de ne rien dire. Chut.